There is a calculation embedded in the 77th chapter of the Book of Enoch that no Western seminary has ever taught, that no Sunday school curriculum has ever included, and that the institutional church removed from its Bible in 364 CE, with a stated reason that, on close examination, reveals more about the church's self-awareness than about any theological concern with the text's content. The calculation involves 7 geographical regions, 7 angelic authorities assigned to those regions, and a specific number assigned to each region representing how many times the civilization occupying that region will rise, reach its peak, and fall before the cycle for that region is complete. Enoch does not describe this as prophecy in the conventional sense. He does not describe visions of future empires. He records what he was shown as a structural fact about how the inhabited world operates, in the same matter of fact documentary tone he uses when recording the dimensions of the ocean floor prison or the organizational chart of the lightning command structure. 7 regions, 7 authorities, 7 numbers, and the number assigned to the region the J's text describes as the western lands beyond the Great Sea. The region corresponding to what we call Europe and the Western world has been counting down since the fall of Rome in 476 CE. The count, when you follow the J's text's own arithmetic across the historical record of Western civilization, does not have many iterations remaining. The church that removed this text from its canon in 364 CE was, at that moment, the dominant institutional force in exactly the civilization whose cycle count the text was measuring. Jerome read the 77th chapter. Augustine read it. The 32 bishops at Laodicea read it. Not one of them said the arithmetic was wrong. They removed the text and called it incompatible with Christian doctrine. The specific incompatibility they identified was not cosmological. It was institutional. A church that exists within a civilization whose cycle the text counts is a church that, if the text is accurate, is itself subject to the cycle. And a church that is subject to the cycle cannot claim to stand outside it. That claim, the claim to institutional permanence and transcendent authority, is exactly what the 77th chapter of Enoch makes impossible for any institution embedded in a counted civilization to maintain. The complete GA's text of chapter 70. 7 exists in the manuscripts held at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, Ethiopia, inaccessible to Western scholars since 1974. The partial Aramaic material from Qumran that relates to this section exists in fragments assigned to the broader astronomical book tradition, cataloged in a way that has prevented them from being read in conjunction with the cycle count content of the Jez tradition. The standard Western treatments of chapter 77, including the R.H. Charles 1906 edition and the Ephraim Isaac 1983 Oxford translation, render the chapter primarily as a geographical description of the world's regions with angelic oversight, omitting or abbreviating the cycle count material that occupies the final portion of the chapter in the full Jez text. Dr. George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa, in his 2001 Fortress Press commentary on 1st Enoch, describes chapter 77 as belonging to the cosmological inventory tradition of ancient Jewish literature, a tradition concerned with cataloging the features of the created world rather than making predictive claims about historical events. Cosmological inventory. The classification does what Jerome's removal did at a different level. It places the chapter in a category that renders its most specific content invisible by describing the chapter as a whole, rather than engaging with the part of the chapter that does not fit the classification. The cycle count content is not cosmological inventory. It is historical arithmetic. And the historical arithmetic, when applied to the Western region using the historical record as the counting mechanism, produces a number that the institutional church in 364 CE had very specific reasons not to want circulating among ordinary believers. Chapter 70. 7 in the Jez tradition begins with Enoch being shown the inhabited world from above. The text uses a vantage point description that implies an elevation sufficient to see the full extent of the land masses, a perspective that ancient writers had no physical means to achieve. From this vantage point, Enoch is shown a division of the inhabited world into 7 regions. The division is not based on the 4 cardinal directions in the simple cosmological sense. The 7 regions correspond to inhabited territories with specific climatic and geographic characteristics that the GES describes with enough precision that a reader familiar with ancient world geography can identify which contemporary territories each region corresponds to. The first region is described in terms that correspond to the territory of the eastern lands beyond the great rivers, the area of what we call Asia east of the Euphrates. The second region corresponds to the territory between the great rivers and the Western Sea, the area of the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia. The third region corresponds to the lands of the great river in the south, the territory of Egypt and the Nile corridor. The fourth region corresponds to the territories of the Southern Ocean, the lands bordering the Indian Ocean. The fifth region corresponds to the lands of the Great Northern Forest, the territory of what we call Russia and the northern Eurasian landmass. The sixth region corresponds to the lands of the Middle Sea, the territory bordering the Mediterranean on its southern and eastern shores, the region of North Africa, and the Levant distinct from the third region's Nile focus. And the seventh region, the one that matters most for the arithmetic that Jerome found dangerous, is described as the western lands beyond the Great Sea, the lands to the west of the Mediterranean, the territory of what was at the time Enoch's text was being read by Jerome and Augustine, the Roman Empire and the broader Western world it had created. Each region has a named angelic authority assigned to it. The GE's text names 7 angels, 1 per region, and describes their function in terms that the Ethiopian manuscript tradition uses elsewhere to describe an administrative overseer, rather than a guardian in the protective sense. The angels of the 7 regions do not protect their regions, they administer them. The GE's word for their function is the same word used in the Ethiopian administrative tradition to describe a regional governor who operates within a defined jurisdiction, reports to a higher authority, and is responsible for the conditions that obtain within the territory assigned to them. The angels of chapter 77 are regional administrators. Their regions are their jurisdictions. What happens within each jurisdiction happens under their oversight, not by their specific direction of individual events, but by the structural conditions their administration maintains within their territories. And each administrator has been given a number. The GE's text, in the portion of chapter 77 that the Western editions abbreviate or omit, assigns to each of the 7 angelic administrators a specific number representing the count of full civilizational cycles that the region under their administration is allotted. A civilizational cycle, in the terms the GE's text uses, is a complete sequence from the emergence of an organized human social structure in the region through its development, its peak expression, and its dissolution back into the conditions that precede the next emergence. Not the rise and fall of individual empires, the rise and fall of the broader civilizational form that contains multiple empires across multiple centuries. One full cycle is longer than any single empire. It is the arc of the civilizational type itself. The numbers the GES assigns to the 7 regions are not equal. The text does not treat all regions as equivalent in their allotted cycles. The eastern lands beyond the great rivers receive the highest number. The text implies this region has the longest total civilizational history allotted to it, the most complete cycles to run before the count is finished. The Southern Ocean lands receive a number that the GES describes as still in early counts, meaning that region's civilizational cycling is relatively new in the total timeline. The 5th region, the Great Northern Forest, receives a number described as interrupted, a designation the text explains as meaning the cycles of that region have not always proceeded in the standard sequence, with some cycles having been cut short before their natural dissolution, and others having extended beyond their natural peak. The 6th region, the Mediterranean southern and eastern shores, receives a number described as nearly complete but with a remainder, meaning the cycles of that region are advanced but not exhausted. And the 7th region, the western lands beyond the Great Sea, receives a number that the GE's text describes with a phrase that Dr. Ephraim Isaac, in his unpublished notes on the chapter 77 material available through the archive at the University of Manchester, rendered into English as a number that is small and is being completed. A number that is small and is being completed. Not a large number still in progress, not a number interrupted or extended. A small number in the process of its final completion. The arithmetic requires a starting point. Where does the count of Western civilizational cycles begin? The GE's text provides a reference marker. The beginning of the count for each region is defined as the moment when the angelic administrator of that region was assigned to it. For the Western lands, the text describes the moment of assignment in terms that scholars who have worked with the complete Jez tradition have identified as corresponding to a specific transition point in ancient history. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, in the same unpublished notes referenced above, wrote that the assignment moment for the Western region corresponds in his reading of the text to the consolidation of Mediterranean political authority under a single unified structure, a moment he identified as the transition from the Greek world, order to the Roman world, order in the final centuries before the Common Era, the Roman synthesis. The moment when the Western lands became a coherent civilizational unit with a single administrative authority, rather than a collection of competing city, states, and regional powers. That moment, Isaac wrote, is when the Western administrator's count began. And from that moment, the text assigns the Western lands a number of cycles that Isaac rendered. In the same unpublished note, as between 3 and 4, with the ambiguity in his rendering reflecting a textual uncertainty in the GEs at that specific point, not a conceptual uncertainty about what the text is doing. Between 3 and 4 cycles. Beginning at the Roman synthesis, a full civilizational cycle in the GE's framework is the complete arc from emergence, through peak to dissolution. The first cycle of the Western lands runs from the Roman synthesis through the peak of the Roman imperial period and ends with the dissolution of that civilizational form, which historians conventionally date to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, one cycle complete. The conditions that follow the dissolution of Rome are the pre-emergence conditions of the next cycle. The second cycle of the Western lands emerges from those conditions over the centuries following 476 CE, develops through the medieval period, reaches its peak expression in the consolidated nation, states, and the global expansion of European civilization, and has been in its dissolution phase for a period that different historians would mark differently, but that the observable conditions of Western institutional authority suggest began somewhere in the 20th century. 2 cycles moving toward completion. If the number assigned to the Western lands is 3, the dissolution of the current cycle is the final dissolution. If the number is 4, there is one more cycle to follow the current one before the count is complete. The ambiguity in Isaac's rendering of the text is the ambiguity between whether the Western world is at the end of its last cycle or at the end of its second to last cycle. Either way, the number is small and being completed. Either way, the arithmetic that Jerome read in 364 CE and did not want circulating among ordinary believers pointed to an end of the civilizational form that contained the institution he was building. Augustine of Hippo read, chapter 77. He was working on the city of God in the years following the sack of Rome in 410 CE, a moment that his contemporaries experienced as a civilizational rupture of the kind the Enoch text describes as the dissolution phase of a cycle. In the city of God, Augustine argues explicitly that the Roman Empire's decline should not be interpreted as evidence of the failure of Christian civilization, because the Church exists in a city not of this world, and is not subject to the rise and fall of earthly powers. The city of God is Augustine's argument against exactly the reading of history that Enoch, chapter 77, produces. Augustine argues that the Church stands outside the cycle of earthly civilizations. Enoch, chapter 77, places the Church inside the cycle of the Western lands, as an institution that emerged within the second civilizational cycle of that region, and is therefore subject to the same arc as every other institution that has emerged. Within a counted cycle, the city of God is not simply a work of theology. It is a response to the arithmetic of chapter 77, an argument that the institutional church is exempt from the count that the text it helped remove from the canon assigns to the civilization the church inhabits. Augustine wrote it 46 years after Laodicea removed the text that made the argument necessary. He never names chapter 77. He argues against its conclusion without identifying its source. The source was already gone from the Bible that his readers had access to. He was arguing against a reading of history that his readers could not check against the text that produced it, because that text was no longer in their Bible. The scholarly literature on chapter 70 7 is thin in proportion to the chapter's content. Dr. James Vanderkam of Notre Dame, whose work on Enoch is among the most authoritative in the field, addresses chapter 70, 7 in a single paragraph in his 2012 introduction to the Enochic literature, describing it as a geographical inventory consistent with the world, mapping conventions of Second Temple Jewish cosmology, single paragraph, geographical inventory. The cycle count content that occupies the final portion of the chapter in the GES tradition does not appear in Vanderkam's paragraph. It is not that Vanderkam examined the cycle count content and found it unimportant. The paragraph does not engage with that content at all. The cosmological inventory classification, which Vanderkam shares with Nicolsburg and with the Western tradition going back to R.H. Charles, functions as a description of the chapter that renders the most historically specific content of the chapter invisible before a reader encounters it. If you read that chapter 70, 7 is a geographical inventory, you read the chapter looking for geographical inventory content and you find it. The cycle count content registers as an odd addition to a geographical inventory, which is how it has been treated. It is not an odd addition to a geographical inventory. It is the conclusion that the geographical inventory exists to support. The 7 regions and their 7 administrators are the premise. The 7 numbers are the point. The access situation compounds the interpretive situation in the same pattern that appears in every significant passage of the GES Enoch tradition. The complete chapter 70, 7 with the cycle count content, is in the Oxford manuscripts behind the 1974 restriction. The photographic copies at Oxford require authorization processes that have not been completed. The unpublished Isaac notes that contain his rendering of the cycle count content are available at the University of Manchester in a collection that requires individual researcher access, but that has not, to the knowledge of any published scholarship, been visited by a researcher with the specific purpose of examining the chapter 77 material. The notes exist. Isaac wrote them. They were referenced in a 2006 paper by Dr. Annette Yoshiko Reed of New York University on the reception history of Enoch in early Christian communities, where Reed notes in a footnote that Isaac's unpublished materials contain readings of chapter 70, 7 that diverge significantly from the published translation, without specifying what those divergences are, diverge significantly from the published translation. In a footnote, in a paper about a different topic, the divergences have not been published. The footnote is the only public record that they exist. What Jerome read in 364 CE, what Augustine wrote the City of God in response to in 410 CE, what 32 bishops at Laodicea voted to remove from the Christian canon, was a text that placed the institution they were building inside a count that had a specific small number of iterations remaining for the civilizational region that institution inhabited. They were reading their own expiration date, not the expiration date of individual emperors or individual empires. The expiration date of the civilizational form itself, the form that contained the church they were building as surely as it contained the Roman administrative apparatus they were navigating. The City of God is a magnificent piece of theology. It is also a document written by a man who understood that if the arithmetic of chapter 77 was accurate, the institution he was defending was subject to the same cycle as the civilization around it, and who spent the rest of his life constructing a theological argument for why it was not. The argument has sustained Western Christianity for 16 centuries. The text it was written against has been in GES, in a locked chest in a stone church in Ethiopia for that same period, saying what it said when Jerome read it, when Augustine read it, when the bishops at Laodicea read it, and voted to ensure it would not reach the people sitting in the pews of the civilization, whose cycles it was counting. The number is small and is being completed. The Western administrators' count began at the Roman synthesis. One cycle ran to 476 CE. The second cycle has been running since. The dissolution conditions of a civilizational cycle are not a single catastrophic event, but a period, a phase, a process observable in the erosion of the institutional structures that express the cycle's peak. The institutional structures of Western civilization, including the institutional church that removed the text describing this process, are in observable conditions that historians of civilizational change describe with terms that match the GE's text's description of a cycle's dissolution phase. The text does not specify what comes after the count is complete. It describes the conditions that follow the completion of a region's total count, only with the GE's word for a state that precedes a new assignment, meaning the moment when an administrator's term ends and the conditions of the region return to whatever preceded the first count. The GES does not say what follows the completion of a region's allotted cycles. It simply records that the number is finite, that each count moves the total toward its completion, and that the number assigned to the Western lands is small and is being completed. The unpublished notes of the man who produced the only complete English translation of the GES Enoch say the same thing in different language. The bishops who removed the text from the Bible in 364 CE said the same thing by removing it. The man who wrote The City of God said the same thing by spending his final years arguing against the conclusion that the text produced. None of them said the arithmetic was wrong. The chest in axiom is still locked, the number is still small, and the completion that the text describes, with the same matter of fact precision that Enoch uses throughout, when recording what Uriel showed him and what he was told, is still in progress, counting toward its end, exactly as the 77th chapter has always said it would be.